Okay, in this lesson we are going to be looking at assignment 5, and I'm going to show you how to approach answering an exam question through using knowledge of a case study city as an example of a city with housing issues and how they can be solved. In this particular lesson we are looking at the need for solving the problem, also the need for managing houses, as we can see in the key idea in the title. Before we have a look at this lesson, I just want to address the question that you're going to be looking to answer in today's lesson. And there it is right there. For a named developed city you have studied, explain the need for housing management. You should refer to a specific named examples for your chosen city. Now we're going to break down that question in a second, but let's just introduce the city we're studying. Now in National 5 you'll have learned about Glasgow and certain housing related issues in that city, what created those problems, especially in the inner city areas, and also how the city is attempting to solve some of its housing problems. In Higher, we're going to look at a contrasting city with many of the similar problems as Glasgow. We're going to look at the UK's largest city, London. The first thing I'd like to do is read through some background introduction to the city, which you'll find on the first page of assignment number 5. And I will just pause the video now as you read through that first page. Okay, now I'm going to assume you've read through this little introduction to London and its history, especially more recent history and some things that affected it. It's worthwhile pointing out this graph because a lot of the problems that London experienced are mainly associated with this period of time, from World War II, when the population was above 8 million, into the 1980s, when it had dropped to about 6.5 million. So London was losing significant numbers of people. Now, since that point in time, it's actually accelerated quite dramatically, and it's now very near to 9 million people. So clearly some of the problems that the city was suffering in the 1980s have been solved, and some of those solutions are down to managing its housing issues, which is the main theme that we're looking at here. If we continue on, we're going to look at the main 2 housing issues that have affected London and still do affect London today. We're going to look at a more historical issue of the fact that the inner city areas of London were suffering from significant decline, and that was linked to the closure of many of the old traditional industries and factories, and the dockyards specifically, that provided hundreds of thousands of jobs to Londoners back before World War II. But since that point in time, a lot of those jobs were lost, and that has specifically affected the inner city area of London, especially an area known as the London Docklands. A more recent issue in London, and also definitely worth considering for anybody who lives in that city, is the impact of rising house prices. So we're going to deal with that as well in today's lesson. So when we think about the inner city area, what are we talking about? Well, you can have a quick little read of that. You can just pause the video and have a little read of that. But if you follow this next bit, the area that we're mainly focusing on is this area here. Now that's the very famous meander that we can see here on the River Thames, and inside it is an area that Londoners would call the Isle of Dogs. And this area here, which I'm indicating on the screen, as well as this area over here, is known as the London Docklands, and that's where most of this case study is based. We can also see on this map the city centre of London, the CBD. That's where all the iconic buildings are that you always associate with London, and then the massive sprawl of suburbs that lie around the inner city area. So what are the main housing issues? What is causing them, and how are they affecting Londoners? And we can see I've categorized them. And these are all things I would suggest you read before attempting to answer, or certainly as you're answering you'll need to read each of them. The one I'm going to specifically talk about in my example of how to answer an exam question is urban decay. So we've got a photograph here of a typical street in east of London, in the Docklands area, that has suffered substantial urban decay. And what we're really looking at is abandoned derelict buildings. Now, why does an area of a city end up like this? Well, it's because people are leaving the area and people aren't wanting to move back in. So the houses become boarded up and eventually become derelict. So we then need to explore why are people leaving that leads to an area becoming decayed. And that's generally because of lack of job opportunities. But in the east of London, it was also compounded by the fact that in the 1940s, during the war, this was an area that was heavily bombed by the Germans. So there'd been a lot of wartime destruction in the east of London that was never repaired. And then as the shipyards and the docks all closed down in the next 20 years after World War II, a lot of people became unemployed, and those that could left the area in search of jobs. I'll look at that idea in the context of the exam question. Now, we have a range of other problems afflicting the east of London that resulted in this area needing managed, that there needed to be things put in place because they were becoming problematic. So we have poverty and depopulation, we have unemployment and industrial closures, and that's to do with the joblessness. We have increases in traffic and pollution because of the inappropriate road networks in the east of London. We have massive overcrowding. We have the first attempted solution in the late 60s and 70s, where they built housing estates that we can see here. So this is the Tower Hamlets, a very famous housing estate in London. And they built it to solve some of the rundown houses, but these in themselves created new sets of problems in an idea known as ghettoization. And you can read that in your own time. Our second main problem is to do with the rapidly soaring house prices, which we can see on this graph. So London lies way above the national average in terms of its average house price. It's very expensive to buy a house. And when you get round to reading it, you'll see both why that is happening, so what causes house prices to be so high in London, but more specifically, you will see three impacts that how high house prices has on the city. So there's one, there's two, and there's three. And how London is affected, specifically out of any city in the UK, from its extremely high house prices. Right, so at this point, when you get down to the actual exam question, I'm going to look for you to answer both in class, once you finish this video, and also as a homework, is this exam question. And I'm going to break down how you actually answer it. So I've got 4 key bullet points here, and I've got a paragraph written to show you how you would develop a point to score multiple marks. The question says for a named developed world city. So you must start by naming your city, and you will see down here that that is something that I've done. I've named London. No mark for that, but it's a requirement of the question, so I needed to name my city. Now, the first thing you need to do is describe a problem which needs managed, because the question does say explain the need for housing management. Okay, not actually how they manage housing, that's not the question, just what is the need? Why is housing a problem, and why does it need managed? Okay, so you could pick up, for example, on urban decay, which was the one I highlighted earlier. And you'll see here, urban decay began to occur because people were leaving this area of the city. This is where buildings start to become very run down and dilapidated. Okay, so now we have a problem identified. Now that's not explaining its need, but we've identified the problem. Okay, it's in the next paragraph where we get to actually that point. We've also identified why this problem exists, because there was little investment, largely because of the amount of war damage from World War II. So let's get to the actual where the mark is. So a combination of decay and lack of investment meant many people left the area, and those that remained became poorer and poorer. Well, if we get to this many people left, that is us now explaining the need. We're explaining why this needs managed, because people are leaving. Okay. If we go a little bit further, we can get a second mark, and it's suggested in the end of this sentence where people are getting poorer and poorer. This resulted in significant crime levels and social problems, which further dissuaded people from moving to the area. So we have a lack of investment and decay causing people to leave, but then we also have crime and social problems in this area, which is also then further encouraging people to leave. So we have 2 reasons to want to solve this problem. Okay, once again, we haven't said anything about it, but we have now explained this third bullet point, why it needs managed. Okay, I've given you another sort of suggestion here. If you want to read the house prices thing, if you haven't done that already, then you can see high house prices force poorer people to live far away from London, and they then have to commute for hours back into the city. So that's one of the reasons, one of the impacts that high house prices has, and why it needs to be managed, why we have to try to control high house prices. Now, finally, you can pick up marks in this type of question for this. Where possible, refer to actual named examples or evidence from London. Marks are always rewarded for this. So depending on the amount of marks allocated to a question, you will be rewarded 1 or possibly 2 marks from doing something like in the Docklands area of East London or Tower Hamlets. You'll see these two referred to in the text. So in our answer, you can see in the Docklands area of East London. Now that's a named example within a city, so that would get you a descriptive credit for naming it, along with the 2 points about people leaving because of decay and people also leaving because of significant crime levels and social problems. Now there are lots of different ways you can word this, but this paragraph would be rewarded for 3 marks. What you now want to do is, using all of the material above, and build up another series of points to ensure that you could achieve 10 marks if this was a 10-mark question. So that's identifying, describing a problem, explaining why it therefore needs managed. Okay, what does this problem create? Why is there an issue? And then, if appropriate, and you have a particular named piece of evidence you can use, you can add that into your paragraph to ensure you get full marks. This is a homework, so please have this set for the due date, completed by the due date, if you don't manage to do it in class.